Welcome back to Outlaw Operations. Tonight, we're diving into a chilling case filled with deception, greed, and betrayal. A story that seemed to be about love and ambition but ended in tragedy. Before we get into it, take a second to drop a comment. Where are you listening from? And if you enjoy true crime storytelling, hit that like button and subscribe. Now, let's settle in and get started. Pinckneyville wasn't the kind of place where you'd expect something awful to happen. Tucked away in the quiet stretches of the United States, the town was simple, peaceful. People knew each other by name, waved at strangers, and the most exciting thing that happened was usually down at Boku Creek, where fishing was a local pastime. That's exactly what two fishermen were doing on the morning of July 25, 2010, trying their luck near the Boku Creek Bridge, just south of town. The water was calm, the sky was clear, but something floating just beneath the surface caught their eye. At first, they thought it was debris. Maybe an old tarp. But as they got closer, the shape became disturbingly familiar. A girl. Face down. Lifeless. Her right arm was tethered to a heavy concrete block with a length of rope, as if someone wanted her to disappear forever. But the creek was shallow, and the summer heat had hastened decomposition. Her body had risen to the surface. Her features were difficult to distinguish, skin bloated and discolored from days in the water. But two things stood out, her belly piercing and a delicate necklace around her neck, the pendant shaped like a musical note. Small things. Personal things. The local authorities moved fast once they got the call. It didn't take long before the jewelry triggered something familiar in their system. A teenage girl had been reported missing just 6 days earlier. Her name was Sydney Stevens. She was only 15. Her parents, Tracy and Tim, had been living through a private storm before their daughter vanished. Their separation had hit Sydney hard, and harder still was the news she had uncovered, that Tim, the man she had called Dad all her life, wasn't actually her biological father. It shattered her world. The grief took its toll in quiet, devastating ways. She stopped talking to friends. Shut herself in her room. Ran away more than once. And more than once, she tried to end her own life. Her parents, frightened for her safety, kept her home under close watch. She wasn't allowed to go anywhere without supervision. Either her mother or her older half-sister, Dakota, stayed with her around the clock. The house was locked tight. That's how it was supposed to be, safe. But on the morning of July 20th, Tracy walked into Sydney's room at 6:30 a.m. and felt the panic rise in her throat. The room was in shambles. Dresser toppled. Clothes scattered like a struggle had taken place. Sydney was gone. Tracy's first thought wasn't just fear, it was confusion. Because everything Sydney owned was still there. Her purse. Her shoes. Her phone. Even her clothes. It wasn't like her to vanish without them. It wasn't like her to log off social media and stay silent. Dakota insisted it was another runaway attempt, but Tracy couldn't believe that. Something didn't feel right. Sydney had left barefoot, probably still in her pajamas. It didn't make sense. She called everyone she could think of, friends, neighbors, anyone who might have seen her. No one had. With a heavy heart, she reported her missing. The police were hesitant. They knew Sydney's past. They figured she'd come home eventually, just like before. So they waited. Let the family and community do the searching. And for 6 agonizing days, there were no answers. Until that call came from the creek. At the station, Tracy was asked to identify the body. The moment she saw the necklace and the piercing, she knew. She didn't need a second look. Dental records would later confirm it, it was Sydney. Her daughter was gone. An autopsy soon revealed what the outside of the body had already hinted at. This wasn't an accident. She didn't drown. She was murdered. Gunshot wounds, blunt force trauma, signs of suffocation. Whoever did this hadn't just wanted her dead, they had wanted her to suffer. Detectives focused their attention back on the house. There had been no signs of forced entry. No broken windows. No picked locks. Which meant whoever took Sydney either had a key or was let in. At the time of her disappearance, only Tracy and Dakota had been home. Tim was away on a business trip. That detail mattered. As is often the case in murders, the investigation started with those closest to the victim. Sydney's inner circle. Her family. Friends. Anyone who had access to her. The name that kept surfacing was Dakota. And alongside her, a 20-year-old named Chad Bennett, her boyfriend. Chad had a record. Minor offenses. Drugs. Theft. Nothing violent, but enough to raise eyebrows. He claimed he had visited Dakota the night before Sydney vanished. They watched a movie, then he went to work. Dakota confirmed the story. Still, detectives weren't convinced. They brought in Chad's group of friends. Carl Dane, 18. James Glazier, 17. Robbie Mueller, 15. All of them knew Dakota well. They were part of her world. At first, the boys gave scattered, flimsy statements. Conflicting timelines. Vague details. But as the pressure mounted, the story began to take shape, dark, twisted, and chilling. On the night of July 19th, the group had gone to Sydney's house. It wasn't a random visit. They had a purpose. A plan. Something sinister. They had decided, as part of a so-called initiation ritual, that they would kill someone. Their original target had been Tracy, Sydney's mother. But as they crept through the house, Sydney woke up. She stepped into the hallway, called out for her mom. She was caught before she could scream. They held her down. Covered her mouth and nose. She struggled until the fight left her body. Somewhere in that moment, the plan changed. Maybe they panicked. Maybe they decided Sydney was an easier target. Whatever the reason, they carried her to the car. She wasn't dead yet. But she came to. Fought back. And that was when the real horror began. They beat her. Strangled her. Tortured her until her body stopped resisting. Then they drove to the creek, tied her to a concrete block, and left her in the water like she was nothing. A 15-year-old girl, betrayed by people her sister trusted. The town of Pinckneyville changed after that. People didn't sleep as soundly. Doors were locked earlier. Parents hugged their children tighter. And for Tracy, there was only the empty silence of a house that used to echo with her daughter's laughter. Sydney's story was no longer just a case file. It was a wound. One that would never fully heal. They thought they had it all figured out. Dump the body in the water, weigh it down with a block of concrete, and let the lake hide their secret forever. But bodies have a way of telling their stories, even in silence. The decomposition didn't go as they expected. Gases built up inside, bloating the body until it floated back up like an accusation no one could ignore. Sydney's body surfaced, exposing everything they tried to bury. On July 28, Carl, James, and Robbie were all in cuffs. Their explanation was thin, shaky. They insisted they had set out to kill someone else, Tracy, but ended up murdering Sydney instead. That alone made no sense. Nothing about the situation did. The most disturbing part. When police recovered Sydney's body, her trousers were pulled down. It suggested something far more horrifying. Maybe rape. Maybe worse. But when questioned, none of them confessed to that. Not a word. The water had erased almost everything, the fingerprints, the bruises, the DNA. Without hard evidence, the police couldn't prove that part of the crime. And the suspects? They passed the blame around like a cigarette, all while saying the lower trousers were just the side effect of drugs. But law enforcement wasn't convinced. They knew this was gang-related. They knew the chain of command. And at the top of it all was Chad. He played innocent, acted like he had nothing to do with it. But in the world these kids moved in, nothing this brutal happened without his go-ahead. Especially not something tied to initiation. Sydney had been shot, several times. The medical examiner traced the bullets to a .22 caliber pistol. Carl had one. A Ruger. Expensive. Too expensive for a kid like him to afford. Under pressure, he admitted the truth, Chad had given him the weapon. That was the first crack in the wall of silence. Detectives leaned in harder, and slowly, the rest started to break. Chad had directed everything. Maybe he hadn't pulled the trigger himself, but he was the architect of it all. Some of the group agreed to testify against him. Still, Chad kept denying he had anything to do with it. He clung to his lies while the walls around him collapsed. The cops weren't done. They suspected someone else was involved. Dakota. Sydney's older sister. Dakota swore she had nothing to do with it. She told them she loved Sydney, that they were close. But people who knew them painted a different picture. Friends, family, they all said the same thing. Dakota didn't like her sister. Sydney always wanted to tag along, hang out with Dakota's group. And Dakota hated that. She wanted her space, her time with Chad. But she had to take care of Sydney while their parents were out working. The cooking, the cleaning, the babysitting, it was all on her. And Sydney? She was just a reminder of everything Dakota didn't want to deal with. At the funeral, Dakota smiled. She laughed and chatted like it was just another school event. Her little sister lay in a casket, and she looked like she didn't have a care in the world. That was all the police needed to keep pushing. They followed her. They questioned her. 4 hours. The detectives threw her off with random, confusing questions, trying to catch her in a lie. Eventually, she cracked, just a little. She said that 2 days after Sydney vanished, she was in Nashville. She overheard Carl and James talking about the murder. At first, she thought they meant someone else. But then she heard Sydney's name. 15 years old. Beaten. Strangled. Drowned. Tied to concrete. That was when it sank in. She said that on July 23rd, she was at Carl's house. She heard them talking again. Carl mentioned the gun, the same .22 Ruger. He said he'd used it. Police pressed her harder. And more details came out. She revealed who was in the car that night. The ones who showed up at the house where Sydney disappeared. She told them what they did to her sister. But she had excuses. She was scared. They threatened her. Carl, she said, told her he'd kill her if she talked. Still, her story wobbled with every word. Detectives noticed how calm she was. Too calm. Like someone relieved, not grieving. Like someone who had finally gotten rid of a problem. To shake her, police pretended they already knew everything. They said they were just missing the why. That threw her off. She started fidgeting, stammering, but never confessed. The case exploded in the media. Everyone had a theory. Rumors buzzed like flies. Some said Dakota found a diary. Sydney's diary. A few pages hinted she might have slept with Chad, 2 years earlier. That would have made her only 13 at the time. Even if it wasn't true, it was enough to burn Dakota alive with jealousy. The timeline didn't match up, Dakota didn't even know Chad back then. But jealousy doesn't need facts. Just suspicion. Police brought Dakota in again. This time, she painted Chad as the monster. Said he was violent. Said he heard voices, claimed the voices told him to kill. She even dragged in Bubby, Sydney's ex, claiming Chad had a problem with him too. Like everything in Chad's world revolved around rage, and Sydney had gotten caught in the storm. But the truth was still tangled in all their lies. Sydney had tried to be part of her sister's world. She just wanted to belong. Instead, she was lured, cornered, and silenced. No one knows exactly what was going through Dakota's mind in those final days before the murder. Whether it was hate, jealousy, or just exhaustion from playing the role of a big sister. But when the concrete block sank into the water, it didn't just try to bury a body. It tried to drown the truth. And yet, the truth rose. Just like Sydney. Silent. Floating. Unavoidable. The fire didn't start with smoke, it started with a scream, one that nobody heard in time. He burned the family home to the ground. Not out of panic. Not to hide something. Just to watch it disappear. They said he even turned a gun on his favorite cat, emptied 15 rounds into its small body. No one could confirm if it was true, but the mere idea was enough to chill the room during questioning. A man who could do that, what else was he capable of? Detectives couldn't ignore the timestamp on the phone logs. It was 10 p.m. the night Sydney vanished. A call from Dakota came through. Some believe it wasn't just a regular check-in. It might have been a signal. That's when the others arrived. Quietly. Too quietly. Maybe they asked her to open the door, maybe they didn't need to. The house had secrets of its own. Whatever the case, something shifted that night, and Dakota wasn't talking. Her silence wasn't just grief, it felt calculated. Evasive. Misdirecting. The detectives knew the signs. She was arrested, not for murder, not yet, but for standing in the way of justice. Obstruction. Still, it wasn't enough to move forward with charges. Not yet. Chad didn't hide what he was. Leader of a gang called the City Saints. His followers obeyed him like he was law. He claimed he didn't order Sydney's death. Claimed he didn't even want it to happen. Said he regretted it. But people like Chad don't usually regret, they rewrite. Still, he swore it. Over and over. Carl took the interrogation harder than the rest. 2 days of questions, and he cracked more than once. Said he was drunk that night. Said Robbie came over, also drunk, and asked him to go somewhere. Carl didn't ask questions. He just grabbed a .22 pistol and followed. That detail hit hard. Why the gun? He cried in the room. Not just once, openly, messily. The kind of crying that makes you wonder if it's grief or guilt or both. Or neither. Was he part of something horrific without even knowing it? Or was this an act? He said Robbie and he picked up James on the way. That's when the story began to darken. They drove to Sydney's home. A quiet house, late at night. Everyone inside asleep. Robbie didn't knock. He climbed the fence and slipped in. Carl waited in the car. But too much time passed. His gut twisted. He followed them inside. The door to the courtyard, the one that led straight to the basement where Sydney lived, it was already open. No broken locks. No signs of forced entry. It had been unlocked. On purpose. That's when Dakota's name surfaced again. Carl said Sydney had woken up. The noise did it. She saw them, Robbie, James. She knew them. Confused, frightened, she tried to wake her mother. Tried to call out. But Robbie didn't let that happen. He grabbed her. She screamed, fought back, tried to break free. But she was outnumbered. They tied her wrists, forced her down on the couch. Still, she wouldn't give up. That's when the gun came out. The shock alone might have been enough to take her under. Maybe it was a hit to the head. Maybe fear just shut her down. Either way, she went limp. She had a history. Mental illness. A pattern of running away. They knew it, and they used it. That's why they made it look like another runaway case. Dragged her out of the basement, through the open door. Threw her into the car. Vanished into the night. Halfway through that ride, she woke up. Kicking. Screaming. Desperate. That's when one of them forced her to the ground. Hands around her neck. Pressed down until her body stopped moving again. They didn't even wait. Just kept going. Reached the river. But she stirred again. Conscious. Broken. Then came the most twisted part of the story. The one they swore was true, even though no one believed them. They said she asked for it. Said she wanted to be close. Said the strangulation was part of a game. But their eyes said otherwise. Everyone knew. It wasn't a game. It wasn't mutual. It was violence masquerading as intimacy. And then someone pulled the trigger. A shot rang out. Sydney's body hit the water. That was the end, or so they thought. Robbie told a different story. Said Carl had a vendetta. That Sydney reminded him of someone else. Said he'd once dated her, for 3 days. She broke it off. Said he didn't care. After that, she started seeing someone else. Carl didn't take it well. Swore he'd make every girl like her pay. Started with Sydney. Robbie, just 15 at the time, claimed he didn't hurt anyone. Said he was just following orders. Trying to fit in. His version didn't clean the blood from his hands, but it showed just how twisted the pecking order really was. October 5, 2012. Everything changed. New details emerged. Chad's crew cracked. One by one, they talked. They gave the police enough to finally build a real case. That same day, Dakota was brought in again. The question was simple: how did the door stay unlocked? Her mother had always kept it bolted. Sydney wasn't allowed out without supervision. House arrest, they called it. For her safety. For everyone's peace of mind. That door shouldn't have been open. But it was. And finally, Dakota spoke. She said it was a prank. Just a stupid prank. She left the door open, knowing her sister would panic. But the prank wasn't hers alone. She met with Chad's gang. They talked about what would happen. She knew. She didn't stop it. She watched it unfold from a distance and never lifted a finger. It was never an accident. Never a mistake. Sydney wasn't supposed to survive the night. And Dakota, she wasn't just a sister. She was an accomplice. In the end, every piece fit. The open door. The silence. The lies. Sydney didn't run away. She was hunted, betrayed, and left to die, by the very people who should have protected her. The truth, when it finally surfaced, was even darker than anyone expected. And it all started with a door that should have never been opened. She was only 16 when she first crossed paths with Chad. What started as innocent curiosity quickly turned into something darker, something dangerous. Chad's group wasn't just a clique. It was more like a secret society hiding behind a mask of rebellion, with rituals that tested loyalty in ways most couldn't stomach. To prove herself, she endured a brutal initiation, the kind that left scars not just on her skin, but deep in her conscience. That trial made her one of them, and explained why, when the killers struck, she didn't just help them, she was one of them. No one understood why she looked so bright and unaffected at her younger sister's funeral. She wore a light dress. Her makeup was perfect. There was even a hint of a smile. People whispered, judging her behind dark sunglasses and clutched tissues. But the truth was much colder than anyone imagined. She wasn't mourning. She was celebrating. That funeral wasn't a moment of loss for her. It was a rite of passage. The final step in completing the ritual to be accepted into Chad's inner circle. Her younger sister, loud, clingy, and always in the way, was a sacrifice. That same night, the group partied. Loud music, red lights, drinks in hand, dancing like nothing ever happened. Carl was there. He laughed that night, the same man who would later break down behind bars and admit everything. On August 18, 2010, he wrote a letter to Sydney's mother, Tracy. His words trembled with guilt. He confessed. He said he knew what he did was evil and that he was ready to give up his freedom for it. But he also asked for something he didn't deserve, forgiveness. Tracy read that letter over and over, searching for any sign of genuine remorse. But to her, Carl's words rang hollow. Not because of what he wrote, but because of what he didn't. There was no real sorrow in his handwriting. Just fear. Fear of the life ahead of him. And maybe fear of the people he once called friends. Carl had been arrested early on, but it took 2 whole years before anyone actually stood trial. The justice system moved slowly, too slowly for the families left shattered. When Carl D.N.E. finally stood before the judge, he didn't fight the charges. He pled guilty to first-degree murder. 60 years. That was his sentence. A lifetime in a cell. But Carl never made it to federal prison. Just weeks before his transfer, guards found him unresponsive, lying cold in his cell. A note clutched in his hand. No excuses, no begging this time, just regret. It was too late. James, another one of Chad's boys, didn't escape justice either. He, too, was found guilty of first-degree murder and handed the same 60-year sentence. But unlike Carl, he showed no cracks in court. No tears. No letter. Just silence. Like he still believed in the twisted loyalty they once swore under dim lights and whispered secrets. Robbie Mueller, one of the youngest in the group, was first sentenced to 37 years. But after an appeal and some legal back and forth, that number dropped to 26. He could walk free as early as 2023. That didn't sit right with Sydney's family, or with Tracy, who had nightmares of crossing paths with him at the grocery store one day. And then there was Chad Bennett, the one who started it all. The self-proclaimed leader. The puppet master. He turned on his own group the moment the walls started to close in. Cooperated with investigators. Took a plea deal. Pled guilty to a lesser charge. Just 20 years. He'll be eligible for parole in 2026. He's the reason this case cracked open. But it doesn't make him any less guilty. Dakota was another name in this tangled web. Another follower. He got 26 years, too, with the chance to ask for parole by the end of 2023. He claimed he didn't want to be involved. That it wasn't supposed to go that far. But in the end, he stayed. Watched. Helped. That was enough. Now rewind the story a bit, away from this madness, and meet someone who never imagined his life would end in the middle of a different tragedy, Martin Durham. Born in 1969, Grand Rapids, Michigan. A simple man who loved nature more than anything else. Hiking, fishing, long walks through Michigan's wild terrain. He was the guy who carried a camera around, always looking for that perfect shot of sunrise cutting through trees or a river splitting through rock. At 17, Martin fell for a girl named Glenna Johnson. High school love. Hot and cold. They'd break up and get back together so many times that even their friends stopped keeping track. But eventually, they went their separate ways, each thinking it was forever. Years later, Martin met Christine. She was different, steady, kind, practical. They clicked almost instantly. Within months, they were living together, building something real. A wedding followed, then kids, 2 boys and a little girl. Martin worked 2 jobs. He fixed cars by day and flipped burgers by night. Life was hard, sure, but it was good. Honest. The kind of life that meant something. But all of that changed in 1995. A truck ran a red light. Slammed right into Martin's car. dragged it for nearly half a block before stopping. Martin was barely alive. Broken ribs. Shattered jaw. Both legs crushed. Brain trauma that doctors said would leave him forever changed. He spent months in a coma. Christine never left his side. Neither did his kids. They prayed, whispered to him in the dark, hoped he could still hear. And slowly, painfully, Martin came back. But not completely. He couldn't remember names. He couldn't walk. He couldn't work. He was trapped in a broken body and a foggy mind, and nothing was ever the same again. Christine went from homemaker to breadwinner overnight. She put the kids in daycare, found a job, juggled bills, kept the house running, and still came home to care for Martin every night. Her love never wavered. But Martin wasn't the man she married anymore. He was angry. Frustrated. Confused. Sometimes violent. He forgot who people were. Stared blankly at old friends. Couldn't even recall his daughter's name. His face bore the scars of the crash. His hands trembled. The outdoorsman who once slept under stars now barely stepped onto the porch. And yet he tried. Every single day. Despite the pain, despite the loss, Martin never gave up trying to find pieces of the man he used to be. But tragedy doesn't strike once. Sometimes it circles back for more. Years later, long after the trial of Chad's group faded from the headlines, Martin Durham would become the center of another shocking crime. One that left neighbors speechless. A twist no one saw coming. But that's a story for another night. The tension in the house had been building for years. What once might have been love had long since curdled into something bitter, toxic. Everyone could feel it, even their friends had stopped pretending that Glenna and Martin were the perfect couple. It was only getting worse. The way they spoke to each other, the way they avoided eye contact, the silence that filled rooms meant for laughter, it all pointed to a relationship that had rotted from the inside out. Still, Glenna had a name inked permanently on her skin, Martin's name. She'd etched it onto the back of her hand 18 years earlier, during their early days, when they believed in forever. And she'd never covered it, not once. That alone said something. Whether it was loyalty, obsession, or a refusal to let go of what once was, no one could quite tell. But she still loved him, even after everything. For 15 years she clung to the hope that they'd find their way back, that maybe love could bloom again in the ashes. But behind closed doors, the reality was anything but romantic. Money became the battlefield. Martin suspected Glenna was hiding things from him, overspending, digging them into debt. Slowly, she took over all the finances. She began controlling every penny, including the insurance checks Martin received each month, money meant to help him recover after the car accident that had nearly broken him. And then there were the pills. Martin had been prescribed strong medications, but he rarely took them. He didn't like how they made him feel, numb, not himself. The pills piled up, untouched. Glenna found a use for them. Quietly, she began selling them. Whether Martin knew, no one could say for certain. Some whispered that he was in on it, that he needed the extra money. Others insisted he was in the dark, just another victim in a web of deceit. They carried on like that for over a decade, together, but fractured. By 2015, the facade had worn thin. They still held hands in public, still smiled when eyes were on them, but it was a performance. Behind the scenes, their arguments were louder, more volatile. One of Glenna's close friends would later recall a fight that ended with Glenna shouting that she'd kill Martin. At the time, it sounded like heat-of-the-moment drama. Looking back, it felt like a warning no one took seriously. That May, things spiraled. Martin's ex-wife Christine stumbled across a listing online. Martin's beloved home was up for auction. She knew how much he loved that place, how he'd spent years perfecting the garden, treating every plant like a child. Confused, she called him. But Martin was just as surprised. He hadn't put the house up for sale. He turned to Glenna, demanding answers. She brushed it off as a mistake, promising to fix it. But the auction was still scheduled for 3 weeks later. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Their car had been repossessed months earlier. Again, Glenna had promised to fix it. Again, nothing had changed. The debt was deeper than Martin realized. And Glenna, instead of coming clean, chose to cover the cracks with more lies. Then came the morning of May 13, 2015. One of the neighbors, just stopping by for a quick chat, noticed something off. Martin always kept the door open in the mornings, always welcomed a conversation. But that day, silence. No answer to the knock. Something felt wrong. The neighbor let himself in, calling out, but there was only more silence. And then, in the bedroom, the truth revealed itself. Martin was on the floor, face down in a pool of his own blood. Just a few feet away, Glenna was sprawled out, blood seeping from her head. The neighbor ran, terrified the killer might still be inside. He dialed 911 with shaking hands. By the time the paramedics arrived, Martin was already gone. Cold. Barely clothed. Dead for hours. Glenna, miraculously, was alive. Conscious. She tried to speak, said something that no one could make out. She was rushed to the hospital, a bullet grazed across her head but no serious damage. Surgery saved her. Recovery was quick. But answers didn't come so easily. She couldn't, or wouldn't, explain what had happened. No signs of forced entry. Nothing was stolen. The cash lying on the table was untouched. No broken windows. No kicked-in doors. It didn't look like a robbery. It looked like something personal. Like whoever did it had been let in. Or had never left. Police started digging. The pills. The side business. The fights. A narrative began to form. Some believed Glenna's involvement in the drug trade had led to a conflict, maybe a deal gone wrong, someone settling a score. But others weren't convinced. Forensics found the weapon. A pistol. Martin's pistol. It had been in the house for years. And yet it had been used to shoot both of them. That raised more questions than answers. Who knew where it was? Who knew how to load it? Who would calmly retrieve it, load it, and shoot two people, unless they knew the victims well? Detectives couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't some random act. It was too deliberate. Too close. Too intimate. And through it all, Glenna remained silent, a woman with her lover's name still tattooed on her skin, a ghost of the girl who once believed in forever, now at the center of a tragedy no one could make sense of. Everyone had their theory. Everyone had a version of what really happened that night. But the truth? It was locked away in the silence between two people who had loved each other, destroyed each other, and maybe, just maybe, died because of it. The bathroom was quiet, sterile, almost untouched, yet full of answers. Officers combed through it again, this time more methodically. Hidden behind a stack of towels, they found Martin's prescription painkillers, untouched. Still sealed. It immediately shifted the narrative. If someone had come to steal drugs, why leave the very thing they'd likely want most? That motive dissolved, and with it, any theory involving a buyer gone violent. Then came the discovery that changed everything, the murder weapon, a small pistol, tucked beneath the living room sofa. And blood. A lot of it. But here's the thing, it didn't belong to Martin, and his body hadn't been found in that room. He was found in the bedroom. That disconnect puzzled detectives. The volume of blood suggested an attack had taken place right there on the living room floor. Was Martin shot there? And then moved? It didn't make sense. Unless someone was trying to stage something. To manipulate the scene, twist the story. And that theory started to hold weight when forensics located a single spent cartridge case in the living room. One shot fired. That shell didn't match the scene in the bedroom, it was something else. Something didn't fit. So they ran the blood samples again. Room by room. And that's when things got truly strange. None of Martin's blood was found in the living room. Not a drop. The heavy bleeding in that space. All belonged to Glenna. It was a hard pivot in the investigation. If Martin had been shot exclusively in the bedroom, then the theory about moving the body evaporated. He was killed right there, in his own bed. But Glenna, she was found in the same room, alive, barely, with a gunshot wound to the head. So how did her blood get in the living room? Doctors explained that Glenna's wound, though traumatic, wasn't immediately fatal. She could have walked. She could have made it to the bedroom on her own after being shot. That revelation opened a darker door. What if she wasn't a victim? Police started circling the theory that Glenna shot her husband first, then turned the gun on herself in an attempt to stage a murder-suicide, one that would remove suspicion from her and paint her as a fellow casualty. She wasn't talking yet. Still recovering in the hospital. But her phone had plenty to say. Detectives dove into her search history and what they found chilled them. The day before Martin's death, Glenna had searched how to operate a specific firearm, the very one used in the killing and her own injury. The Jugger 6. A gun she shouldn't have needed to know about. Even worse, they found 2 letters tucked away in her phone's notes, farewell letters. Apologies to her children. A final goodbye to the world. Everything pointed to a plan. A deliberate, cold, and unraveling one. The court reviewed the evidence, and slowly the picture began to take shape. Glenna, burdened by crushing debt and a gambling addiction she had kept hidden, saw no way out. But if she was going to disappear, she couldn't leave Martin behind. So she made her choice. Martin was shot in the bedroom. Glenna shot herself afterward, in the living room, and somehow made her way back to the scene. Her wound wasn't as severe. She survived. And from her hospital bed, she denied everything. She claimed the letters weren't hers. That she never wrote them. That she never searched for the gun. That she had no memory of that entire day. To investigators, the denial was more than frustrating. It was calculated. Without a confession and no eyewitnesses, it seemed the case would lose steam. Glenna left the hospital after months of recovery. No charges. Just suspicion. Enough to cloud everything, but not enough to convict. Then, something entirely unexpected happened. Christine, Martin's ex-wife, had taken in their family's parrot after the tragedy, just a small comfort for the children. One night, weeks after Glenna's release, Christine was jolted awake by the bird's voice. Not just random words. A phrase. A sentence. The same one, over and over. Don't shoot, Glenna, don't shoot. At first, she froze. Shocked. Then fear took over. She recorded it. Played it back. It was clear. The voice, the name. A chilling echo of something the bird must have heard in those final moments. She gave the recording to police. At first, it was almost laughable. A parrot? As evidence? But it wasn't funny. It was horrifying. And it lined up with everything they already suspected. The parrot may not have been an official witness, but it was a living, breathing recording device that had heard something it was never meant to repeat. The case exploded again, media, public opinion, everyone drawn into the bizarre twist. But this time, detectives moved quickly. By late June 2016, police had enough to make their move. Glenna was arrested. She was no longer the grieving widow or the wounded survivor. She was the prime suspect. A woman so trapped by debt and shame, she chose to end 2 lives instead of facing her own failures. Prosecutors pushed hard. The farewell letters. The search history. The trajectory of the bullets. The movement of the bodies. Even if the parrot's testimony wouldn't be formally submitted in court, it had helped uncover the final piece of the puzzle. In the end, it wasn't about a parrot. It was about a plan. A marriage shattered by lies. A woman pushed to the edge by addiction. And a man who never saw it coming, shot while he slept beside the person he trusted most. And justice, it came late. But it came. Jeff had been doing everything he could just to hold it all together. He worked the farm tirelessly, coming home each day with aching limbs and a weight pressing heavier on his chest. His wife, Kim, was doing her part, taking care of their 3 kids, trying to stay present, trying to stay sane. But the bills, especially the ones for medication, were piling up faster than the crops could grow. The stress was relentless, and more than once, it broke Jeff down. Quietly. Alone. Kim was still recovering. The accident had left her body fragile and her mind in darker places. There were moments when she opened up to her doctors, when she let the mask slip just enough for them to see the pain inside. She admitted that some days, she wished she wouldn't wake up. That if she died in some sort of accident, it might make life easier for everyone else. Less of a burden, she said. That scared them. It scared Jeff. So they did what they could, they removed all the guns from the house. But it was a farm. Guns were a necessity, not a choice. Eventually, they were brought back, tucked away, hidden from Kim. She missed her job. Nursing had been her purpose, her identity. When she couldn't work, it was like she lost a part of herself. The kids were her lifeline, the reason she kept going. She loved them deeply, and being with them was the one thing that still felt right. By 2013, she started trying to reclaim her life. She went back to work, slowly, just a few hours a week, nothing like before. She got tired easily, forgot things. But it was something. And she started volunteering too, speaking about road safety, about traumatic brain injuries, topics that hit home. By mid-2014, it felt like things were turning around. The fog was lifting. Kim's sister Jenny came by in August to celebrate little Phoebe's 6th birthday. For a moment, it was like the past had loosened its grip. Laughter filled the rooms again. Jenny left that day feeling hopeful. She had no way of knowing it would be the last time she'd ever see her sister. September 8, 2014, was an ordinary Monday. Kim took the kids to catch the school bus like she always did. In the afternoon, their housekeeper, Lauren, arrived. The kids came home around 3:30 p.m., bubbling with their usual school day stories. The day before had been Father's Day. Jeff was supposed to spend it with the kids, but Kim had been exhausted and needed rest, so plans shifted. There was a small argument that day, nothing major. Jeff got into it with Fletcher, their 10-year-old, over a football game. Jeff usually refereed when the kids played, but something about the way Fletcher acted set him off. Words were exchanged. Kim later tried to console Fletcher. That kind of tension, it never used to be there. Jeff told the family he was heading to his parents' farm to visit. Said Kim, the kids, and Lauren were staying back to handle chores. His parents noticed right away that something was off. Jeff was quiet, withdrawn. Not like himself. He didn't smile. Didn't talk. He brushed off their questions and went home without much of a word. Lauren noticed it too. She said there was a small argument between Kim and Jeff, something about how the kids were being raised. Kim was upset about junk food, TV, things Jeff let slide. But there was more under the surface. Kim mentioned that one of Jeff's brothers had dipped into their shared family fund, bought a house, a car. She said Jeff had been giving large sums of their money to his side of the family. She was tired. Hurt. Frustrated. By 7 p.m., the kids were bathed and curled up on the couch watching TV. Kim was still upset. The tension hadn't passed. At 7:30 p.m., Lauren said her goodbyes. The kids hugged her. Jeff called out, "Goodbye. Thank you. See you tomorrow." The house fell silent after she left. No one knows exactly what happened after that. The next morning, Lauren came back like she always did. From a distance, she saw Kim lying on the lawn, still in her pajamas. She hurried over, thinking maybe Kim had fainted or fallen. But something was wrong. Kim wasn't moving. 2 jackets were draped over her face. When Lauren pulled them away, what she saw would never leave her. Kim was gone. A bullet had entered just above her right eye. Her body was cold, the blood already drying beneath her. Lauren screamed. Called emergency services. Nothing could be done. Kim was 41 years old. Inside the house, it was worse. Police arrived and began a search. In the hallway, they found a shell casing. In the bedrooms, pure horror. Fletcher, Phoebe, and Mia, all 3 of the children, had been shot in the head while they slept. Execution style. No signs of struggle. No warning. On the kitchen table, there was a napkin. Scrawled on it were 6 simple words, "I'm sorry. It's all my fault." Adult handwriting. No name. Just guilt bleeding into paper. Investigators believed Jeff wrote it. But Jeff was nowhere to be found. No goodbye. No explanation. Just silence. And 4 bodies. It started like any other quiet night on the outskirts of Lockhart. The Hunt family's home, tucked away in the countryside, stood still under the weight of silence. By morning, that silence turned into a roar of grief and confusion. What really happened inside those walls no one could say for certain, not at first. But there were only 2 roads to consider. Either someone broke into the house, killed Jeff Hunt's family, and dragged him away, or Jeff himself pulled the trigger and disappeared into the darkness. With no signs of forced entry, no unfamiliar fingerprints, no DNA traces, just the bodies of Kim Hunt and their 3 children, suspicion quickly narrowed. Jeff was nowhere to be found. That alone stirred anxiety. If he wasn't dead, where was he? If he wasn't taken, what had he done? He was declared a wanted man, and the search began. Word of the tragedy spread like wildfire through the small town. Panic mixed with heartbreak. Families locked their doors early. People whispered in supermarkets, exchanged heavy glances at church. No one wanted to believe that Jeff, friendly, helpful Jeff, could have done it. A loving father, a devoted husband, a fixture at community events and kids' football games. If he wasn't the victim, then they had to believe something even darker. He was the one who lit the match. Some clung to the hope he'd been kidnapped. That maybe he was out there, hiding from the same killers who butchered his family. Others wanted answers, fast. Safety suddenly felt like a luxury, and until someone was arrested, no one in Lockhart could sleep soundly. Police combed through the farm, eyes on every detail, until they noticed something, the fresh imprint of tires in the dirt. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The track stretched out toward a quiet dam just a few hundred meters from the house. Divers slipped into the murky, waist-deep water. They didn't have to go far. There he was. Jeff Hunt, slumped underwater with a shotgun at his side. A single shot to the head. He'd put the barrel in his mouth and pulled the trigger. He'd been dead nearly 30 hours. On the dining table at home, a note, simple, final, matched his handwriting perfectly. No doubt, it was his. That was when the picture became clearer. Not cleaner, not easier to accept, just clearer. No witnesses. No one to tell the full story. But evidence stitched together a grim narrative. The children were asleep when he killed them. Kim must have tried to escape, maybe realizing what he'd done. He shot her too. Then, in what some believed was a moment of regret, he left the note and drove off, disappearing into the night with the same hands that had torn his world apart. The car was found abandoned on a worn paddock trail, barely a few hundred meters from the water. Why he did it, no one really knew. He hadn't left behind an explanation, only devastation. Locals who once called him a friend refused to believe it. Not Jeff. Not the man they'd trusted with their kids, their events, their lives. Some even turned on Kim, saying she must have done it, called her unstable, a witch, blamed her antidepressants. Claimed she framed him. But the evidence didn't lie. She couldn't have fired the gun. The injuries, the distance from the shell casings, the limitations in her right side, it didn't add up. Experts agreed. Jeff Hunt killed his family. Still, the town struggled to accept it. Even in the face of truth, many remembered the man they knew, not the man who did this. They mourned him, raised money for his funeral as well as the victims. They painted him as a broken man, not a murderer. A father who lost his way, not one who destroyed everything. And yet, the facts were stark. Jeff murdered his children. He murdered Kim, a woman who had already survived a car crash and was slowly reclaiming her life. Then he ended his own, leaving behind chaos and a hole in the town's heart that would never fully close. Police searched for a reason, some clue to explain what pushed him over the edge. There had been an argument with his son, tension with Kim. But nothing serious enough to predict a massacre. When Lauren, a close family friend, was there earlier that day, things seemed normal, tense, maybe, but not violent. She'd never seen Jeff lose control, never heard him raise his voice, never witnessed even a slap or scream. Kim, on the other hand, did sometimes shout, especially when off her medication, but nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing like this. Jeff had financial troubles, sure, but manageable ones. He was still putting food on the table, still planning for the days ahead. He had made lunch for the kids, prepped their school bags. Normal dad stuff. That's what made it so hard to swallow. There were no warning signs. Not even Lauren, who saw them every day, noticed anything amiss. In the end, police concluded it was spontaneous. A snap. A breakdown with irreversible consequences. Jeff, the man Lockhart once admired, would forever be remembered not for his community work, but for the cold-blooded slaughter of his own family. And though some still whispered of doubt, the truth stood tall, heavy, and undeniable. Jeff had always kept to himself, carrying the weight of a troubled mind beneath his calm exterior. It was the kind of burden that no one noticed, until it was too late. Just weeks before the tragedy, Kim had confided in a relative, speaking openly about the deep cracks in her marriage. Her once thriving relationship with Jeff had turned sour. They struggled financially, the pressure building with each passing day. Jeff's inability to manage their finances only added fuel to the fire. But the breaking point wasn't just money. Kim had confessed to feeling trapped, unloved. She no longer felt any attraction to her husband, and the thought of divorce was no longer a distant possibility. It was a decision she had already considered, and it was a conversation she had shared with Jeff. The idea of separation seemed to stir something in him, a feeling of betrayal that would ultimately fester into something much darker. Jeff, on the other hand, had been seeing a psychotherapist, trying to hold his unraveling life together. His sessions, though helpful, only revealed a deeper fear, the fear of being left alone with the children. His anxiety built as the weight of his impending loss grew heavier. He had been struggling for months, perhaps even years, with feelings of sadness and despair, yet no one could truly see the storm raging within him. He had always been quiet, reserved, avoiding any discussions about his mental health. As a man, he was taught not to show weakness, to bottle it all up. But what happened when that bottle eventually cracked? In the days leading up to the fatal event, Jeff's behavior became noticeably strange. He visited his family, looking visibly distressed, his face drawn tight with worry. He remained unusually silent, his eyes filled with a haunting emptiness. His family, worried and confused, tried to reach out, but Jeff wouldn't speak. It was as if he was hiding something, something too heavy to bear. And in the silence, his mind only spiraled deeper into despair. Experts who later reviewed the case suggested that Jeff had been overwhelmed by depression, the kind that had festered and grown into something far more dangerous. He had spent so long trying to appear normal, concealing his true emotions, that he had reached a breaking point. It's often said that men, in particular, struggle with expressing their vulnerabilities. The fear of being seen as weak, of being judged, can silence even the loudest cries for help. Jeff's mental state had deteriorated in private, and the pressure of his deteriorating marriage only added to his growing anxiety. When the day finally arrived, Jeff seemed almost detached from reality. The pressures of caring for Kim, who was sick and no longer the woman he had married, had left him drained. Kim's changed personality, her growing dissatisfaction with their life together, weighed heavily on him. It all culminated in a single, horrifying decision. He might have convinced himself that he was protecting his family, saving them from a future of financial ruin, a future he believed was inevitable with the divorce. He chose to end their lives, not out of malice, but in a twisted act of mercy. He aimed to spare them the suffering that he thought lay ahead, pulling the trigger with the chilling belief that he was saving them from pain. The tragic deaths of the Hunt family marked one of the darkest Father's Days in Australian crime history, a day that would forever be etched in the minds of those who knew them. But the story doesn't end there. There is another, even more disturbing case that still sends chills down the spine of anyone who hears it, the case of Lucy Letby. This story began in 2015, in the quiet halls of a neonatal unit in Chester, England. It was an unassuming hospital at first glance, but something sinister was unfolding within its walls. Around 700,000 babies are born in the UK each year, and a small percentage of them end up in specialized care. In the neonatal department of this hospital, staff began to notice an alarming trend: the death toll among premature and ill babies was rising at an unprecedented rate. From June 2015 to June 2016, the number of infant deaths spiked, leaving doctors and nurses on edge. Internal investigations found no medical explanations for the deaths, and yet, something felt deeply wrong. The hospital's management had no answers, and the increasing number of fatalities raised suspicions. It wasn't until police were called in that the truth began to emerge. Through a painstaking investigation, they discovered that one of their own, the nurse who had worked at the hospital for years, was responsible for the deaths. The truth was even more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. 5 years after the first death, the families of the murdered children were forced to relive their worst nightmare. They were contacted by the police, forced to testify, and confront the shocking details of what had happened to their babies. The nurses' actions were chillingly deliberate. Babies had been poisoned, suffocated, and, most disturbingly, injected with air, an insidious method that left little evidence. The air bubble would travel to the baby's heart, blocking the blood flow and causing cardiac arrest. It was a method that was almost impossible to trace, making the deaths appear as though they were natural. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that this nurse had methodically killed, using her medical knowledge to exploit the very systems meant to save lives. She had studied blood flow, and after completing courses designed to enhance her qualifications, she knew how to use air as a weapon. Her actions were not out of a twisted desire for revenge, but rather, something much more sinister. In the case of one baby, the parents had visited every day, praying for recovery, but one night, their newborn's condition took a turn for the worse. The doctors, unable to explain the sudden deterioration, declared the child beyond saving. The parents were forced to make the unimaginable decision to disconnect their baby from life support. The nurse continued to work, seemingly unaffected by the horrors she had caused, until she attempted to harm another infant. This time, the child managed to survive. The true motive behind her actions remains unclear. Was it a desire for power? A twisted sense of control? Or was it something darker, a compulsion that she could not escape? The tragedy of the neonatal unit left a scar on the hospital, and on the families of the children who had lost their lives. The case of Lucy Letby stands as one of the most chilling and heartbreaking in British forensic history, a story of trust broken in the most unimaginable way. And like many other stories, it serves as a grim reminder that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are those we never suspect. The rain had been pouring for hours, a relentless downpour that seemed to echo the mood in the small suburban neighborhood where the Walker family lived. Beneath the sound of the rain tapping against the windows, a storm was brewing inside the home, a storm of secrets, betrayal, and a slow-burning rage that would soon erupt into something tragic. Thomas Walker had always been a quiet man. To outsiders, he was the model of patience and stability, a man who kept to himself and took pride in his work as a mechanic. He had a steady job, a modest home, and a wife, Sarah, who, at least on the surface, seemed to be the perfect partner. They had 2 children, Ben, a bright 12-year-old with dreams of becoming a scientist, and Emily, a 9-year-old with a love for drawing. The family appeared to have it all, a house full of love, laughter, and hope for the future. But beneath the surface, things were unraveling in ways no one could have predicted. For months, Sarah had been distant, her once warm demeanor now replaced with a cold, almost calculated detachment. She had become critical, constantly pointing out Thomas's shortcomings, his inability to manage money, his lack of ambition, his failure to provide a life they both had once dreamed of. At first, Thomas tried to shrug it off. But as the months passed, the harsh words began to cut deeper, leaving scars that could no longer be ignored. Thomas had tried everything to fix things. He worked longer hours, trying to earn extra money, hoping it would ease some of the tension. He even suggested therapy, but Sarah brushed him off, claiming nothing could fix their marriage. And then, one fateful evening, the bombshell dropped. Sarah had told him, with a cold finality, that she wanted a divorce. It wasn't just a passing thought, she had already made up her mind. She no longer loved him, she said. She was no longer willing to settle for a life that made her feel trapped. The words hit Thomas like a physical blow, but it wasn't just the idea of losing Sarah that tore him apart. It was the thought of losing his family, of seeing his children grow up without a mother and father under the same roof. The very idea of that ripped through him with a fierce urgency. He could feel his world crumbling, piece by piece, and he didn't know how to stop it. In the days that followed, Thomas grew more withdrawn. He stopped eating, barely slept, his mind racing with thoughts of Sarah's cold indifference and the future he was about to lose. The anxiety gnawed at him, turning every small worry into a mountain. He had always been the strong one, the protector, but now he felt weak, helpless, and utterly alone. One evening, after an argument in which Sarah had again threatened to leave, Thomas stood in the kitchen, staring at the knife block. He wasn't thinking clearly, his mind was clouded by rage, fear, and desperation. It was as though a switch had flipped, and the man who had always been patient and composed was no longer in control. In a moment of fury, he reached for a knife, his hand trembling as he gripped the handle. He had never imagined doing something like this. His entire life had been about keeping the peace, avoiding confrontation. But the thought of losing everything, the love of his life, his children, the life they had built, was more than he could bear. His mind raced, but the more he thought about it, the more it seemed like the only solution. A way to end the pain. A way to keep his family from being torn apart. It was Sarah who found him in the kitchen that night. She had been making her way to bed when she saw the flicker of movement through the doorway. What happened next unfolded with terrifying speed. There was a struggle, a desperate cry, and in an instant, it was over. The knife fell from Thomas's hand, his heart pounding as he realized what he had just done. The silence that followed was deafening. It was as if time itself had stopped, holding its breath. In the dim light of the kitchen, Thomas looked down at Sarah, his wife, the mother of his children, lying motionless on the floor. It wasn't what he had planned, not in any way, shape, or form. He hadn't meant to kill her. But in that moment of madness, the line between life and death had blurred. When the police arrived, it wasn't with the usual sense of urgency. The call had been made anonymously, and when they arrived at the house, they found Thomas sitting on the kitchen floor, his hands stained with his wife's blood. The shock was evident in his eyes, but there was no remorse. It wasn't because he didn't feel guilty, it was because he couldn't grasp the full weight of what had just occurred. He had always prided himself on being a good man, a loving father. But now, he was something else entirely. The investigation that followed revealed the depth of the couple's dysfunction. Neighbors recalled hearing the frequent arguments between Thomas and Sarah, and friends noted that something had been off with him in the months leading up to the tragedy. It became clear that, like many others before him, Thomas had been hiding his emotional turmoil, unable, or unwilling, to ask for help. The years of quiet suffering had finally boiled over into a deadly eruption of violence. Psychologists who later analyzed the case speculated that Thomas had been suffering from a deep depression, coupled with intense feelings of inadequacy and fear of abandonment. The fear of losing his family, of becoming just another broken man, alone and forgotten, had consumed him. And when Sarah's announcement pushed him to the brink, it was as though he saw no other way out. The decision to kill her wasn't driven by hate, but by a desperate, twisted need to preserve his family at any cost. The aftermath of that night left the entire community shaken. Thomas was arrested, charged with murder, and sent to trial. The weight of his actions was too much to bear, and even as he sat in the courtroom, surrounded by lawyers and judges, he was a shell of the man he once was. His children were left to pick up the pieces of their broken lives, haunted by the memory of a father who had once been their protector, but who had now become their nightmare. In the end, there were no winners in this story. The Walker family was destroyed, not by an outside force, but by the very people who were supposed to love and protect each other. Thomas's rage, his fear, and his loneliness had led to a tragedy that no one could have predicted, and now the echoes of that night would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. It was a stark reminder of how fragile the human mind can be, and how, in moments of unbearable pain, the choices we make can change everything, forever. The sun had long since set, casting a deep darkness over the sleepy town of Waverly. The kind of darkness that wraps around you like a heavy blanket, muffling the sounds of the world and leaving you alone with your thoughts. And for Amanda Clark, that night felt particularly heavy. The weight of it pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to move. But she had no choice, she had to move. She had to confront what had been festering for far too long. Amanda's marriage to Greg had always seemed perfect on the surface. They were the couple everyone envied. Greg, a successful lawyer, had a charisma that made him beloved by his colleagues and friends. Amanda, a warm and devoted mother, had put her career on hold to raise their two children, Jake and Sophie. Their house was beautiful, their lives seemingly flawless. But the truth, hidden beneath the polished exterior, was much darker. For years, Amanda had tried to ignore the cracks in their marriage. The late nights at the office. The constant phone calls that Greg would take in private, his voice tight with tension. The whispers that she heard from others, about Greg's affairs. She had chosen to look the other way, telling herself that the rumors weren't true. After all, they had built this life together. Their children were happy, their home was comfortable, and surely, they could get through anything. But then came the moment that shattered her world. She had discovered the truth. Greg wasn't just having an affair, he had been having several. The discovery had come when Amanda stumbled across an old message on Greg's phone, a message that had been left carelessly, not even trying to hide the affair from her. The betrayal was undeniable. The love she had built her life around crumbled in an instant, and with it, her trust in everything she had believed in. For weeks, Amanda wrestled with the decision to confront Greg. She had never imagined her marriage would end this way, with lies and deceit tearing it apart. But it wasn't just the affair that tore her apart, it was the realization that Greg had stopped loving her long before she had even noticed. He had checked out of their marriage, emotionally and physically, while she had continued to pour everything she had into keeping their family together. Now, with the truth laid bare, she could no longer ignore the raw wound that had been festering in silence. On that particular evening, Amanda had waited for Greg to come home. She had prepared herself mentally, steeling her resolve. She had to confront him. She couldn't keep living in a lie, pretending that everything was fine when it was falling apart around her. When Greg finally walked through the door, Amanda was sitting in the living room, her heart racing. She could see it in his eyes, the way he stiffened when he saw her waiting for him. The guilt was written all over his face, though he didn't know how to hide it. He knew this conversation was inevitable, but nothing could have prepared him for the fury in Amanda's eyes. "What's going on, Amanda?" Greg asked, his voice tight, trying to sound calm but failing miserably. Amanda didn't speak at first. She simply stood up, her hands shaking as she pulled out her phone, showing him the message she had found, the proof of his infidelity. She watched as his face went pale, his mouth going dry, unable to form words. "You think I didn't know?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mix of disbelief and anger. "You've been lying to me for years, Greg. You think I wouldn't find out?" Greg opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He was a man who had always been able to talk his way out of anything, to manipulate the situation to his advantage. But this time, there were no words that could fix this. "I trusted you," Amanda continued, her voice growing stronger. "I loved you. And you threw it all away for what? A cheap affair. More lies. More betrayal." Her words were like daggers, each one cutting deeper than the last. Greg, unable to look her in the eye, lowered his gaze to the floor. Amanda had never seen him like this, broken, exposed, vulnerable. He had always been the confident, assured man, the one who had controlled everything. But now, the control was slipping through his fingers, and the power dynamic had shifted. For the first time, Amanda held the reins, and Greg knew it. "I'm sorry, Amanda," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't mean for it to happen." But Amanda couldn't hear him. She had stopped listening to his excuses long ago. She had heard it all before, over and over again, each time with more empty promises. She couldn't take it anymore. The pain of the past years, the doubts, the lies, it was too much to bear. Her mind raced, but it was clear now, there was no going back. Suddenly, without warning, she turned and walked toward the kitchen, her thoughts a blur. She didn't know what she was doing, but the anger, the hurt, the betrayal, it all surged through her in one overwhelming wave. She grabbed the nearest object, a heavy kitchen knife, and held it in her hand. The cold steel felt heavy in her grip, almost like a reflection of the weight on her shoulders. Greg followed her into the kitchen, his voice growing more frantic, trying to talk her down. "Amanda, stop. Put it down. Please. We can fix this." But there was no fixing it. Not anymore. Amanda's hands were shaking as she turned to face him, the knife held firmly in her hand. The fury inside her burned like wildfire, and in that moment, she was no longer the woman who had once loved him. She was someone else entirely, someone who had been pushed to the edge by years of deception. Greg stepped forward, his voice shaking with fear. "Amanda, please don't. We can work this out. We can fix this." But Amanda was too far gone. The years of pain, the years of holding it all in, came crashing down in an instant. Her arm moved before she even realized what she was doing, and in a swift motion, the knife found its mark. Greg's body jerked as the cold steel pierced his flesh, and the shock on his face was enough to haunt Amanda for the rest of her life. Time seemed to slow as he crumpled to the floor, the life draining from his eyes. Amanda stood there, frozen, her chest heaving with ragged breaths. She had just killed the man she had once loved, the man she had trusted with her heart and her children's future. But now, all that was left was a cold, unfeeling emptiness. The police arrived shortly after, finding Amanda standing over Greg's body, her face pale and her hands covered in his blood. She had no words to offer, no explanation, only the broken remnants of a marriage that had ended in the most tragic of ways. The trial that followed was a long and painful process. Amanda's defense claimed that she had acted in the heat of the moment, driven by years of betrayal and emotional torment. But in the eyes of the law, it didn't matter. She was convicted of manslaughter, a woman who had once been a loving wife and mother, now reduced to a criminal. The children, Jake and Sophie, were left to navigate a world without both their parents. Their childhoods, once full of hope and possibility, had been shattered by the devastating consequences of one violent, impulsive act. Amanda Clark's story serves as a painful reminder of how far someone can be pushed before they break. How the slow burn of betrayal, if left unchecked, can lead to a tragedy that no one sees coming. In the end, it wasn't just Greg's life that was lost, it was the life of a family, torn apart by a moment of unthinkable violence.